Are there any players on the Arizona Cardinals that are worth buying this offseason? All that and more in this episode of the Locked On Dynasty Football Podcast.
You are Locked On Dynasty Football, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Here are your hosts, Mosher and Kate Magdziuk.
Welcome back to the Locked On Dynasty Football Podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. We'd like to thank you for making us your first listen of the day. This episode is brought to you by FanDuel, the official sportsbook of the NFL. Make every moment more. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn today to get started. I am your host, Marcus Mosher. You can follow me on Twitter at Marcus_Mosher. Joining me today, as always, is Kate Magdziuk. You can check her out on Twitter at Kate Magdziuk. Kate, today we are taking a look at the Arizona Cardinals heading into the 2023 season. We are going to go through some buys, some sells, and some holds. First question, is there anybody worth buying with this Arizona Cardinals team?
You know what? I actually think there might be. So let's just talk about the Cardinals here for a brief minute, because I don't think there's any team that we're expecting to take a bigger nosedive in 2023. In terms of like their expectations heading into 2022, things were sky high. You had the upside of Kyler Murray, who had been paid. You had what seemed to be a competent coaching staff. Like it seemed like things were coming together in 2022, but it just never came together. Season just never came to fruition. You knew that there were rumblings all season long, pretty much. Kevin Stefan or
Cliff Kingsbury. Yeah.
Cliff Kingsbury. Thank you.
Yep.
Kevin Stefanski apparently on my mind this
beautiful
Monday morning.
Yeah.
Like Cliff Kingsbury, the rumblings there was some weird stuff with the GM, but they've cleaned house effectively. Kyler Murray, unfortunately, out with a torn ACL suffered at the end of last year. The expectations have been never lower for this team, and it's definitely reflected right now in the average draft position for each of these players for Dynasty. So, you know what? Like, I think honestly, Marcus, and I'm going to get into this with the sells, you could make an argument that there's not a lot of risk in buying any of these players, to be totally
We've
frank.
seen almost every single one of their offensive players see their dynasty value just suppressed right across the board this offseason, because number one, I think this offense is just going to run less plays or fewer plays than we've seen in the last couple of years with Cliff.
Yep.
And with the uncertainty at quarterback, like, is it going to be Clayton Tune throwing balls to Michael Wilson and Hollywood Brown early in the season? Maybe. And I think that's the hard part here. Is we're projecting what this offense looks like with a new quarterback and a new play caller. It's going to be different.
It's going to be different, but I do think that like this is a time to remind ourselves that Dynasty is the long game, not necessarily the short game, even though the short game outlook for this team is absolutely dreadful.
Rough.
This is where you look at the team and say, are there any like talented players that I believe in? I think you could make an argument for Kyler Murray, currently sitting at quarterback 12. I think he's starting to fall in terms of that ADP just because of the concerns. Like if they have the number 1 overall pick in 2020, 2024, like, is that Caleb Williams? Do they just scrap it? Because we've already seen them do it, right? Like we've already seen them take their lumps and move on. But I'm gonna make the argument here for wide receiver Michael Wilson, rookie wide receiver Michael Wilson, who I liked quite a bit in terms of like the value here for what the Cardinals were able to get. Wasn't necessarily projected as a super high pick, but they got him in end of the 3rd round, pick 94 overall. But a guy that's had a lot of injury struggles over his career, very unfortunately out of Stanford. Just this past season had 421 receiving yards, 4 touchdowns before having his season once again end prematurely. But just a solid build of a wide receiver, 209, 6'2", just one of these bigger guys, but he moves super well. He moves like a guy smaller than he is. And I love his route running. I love his physicality. and the way that he's able to just make physical plays. I like his athletic profile. I think all around, Michael Wilson is a guy that, I could picture being a center point of this offense.
Mhm.
Especially with the departure of DeAndre Hopkins, especially knowing that, um, you know, we're not going to expect anything out of Michael Wilson from the get, especially considering the quarterback position. I think he's a good enough route runner that, you know, biding that time with whoever is going to be throwing him the ball in this next year, I'm willing to buy in and especially take that discount, knowing that I think we'll probably maybe see Kyler Murray this season. And if we don't, if it's Caleb Williams throwing him the ball,
Yeah.
okay, like, you're going to see that ADP absolutely climb. But I do think from a consistency standpoint, when I'm projecting Michael Wilson, like, obviously you can make the argument for Marquise Brown. We've seen an incredibly high ceiling, but I think we've also seen a relatively low floor. I think Michael Wilson is a cheaper version of that with
Yep.
maybe not quite as high of a ceiling, but a low enough or a high enough ceiling to make it worth it.
So a couple things here. First of all, the draft capital. We kind of thought maybe he would go early day 3. He goes in round 3, which that matters with the whole new front office. Them spending a top 100 pick on Michael Wilson just makes me feel better about it. The draft capital does matter. On top of that, let's look at some of the other investments they've made. They traded for Hollywood Brown a year ago, but that was with a different GM, right? Rondale Moore was drafted by a different front office. Now, Greg Dortch was somebody that they did bring back, but I don't think Greg Dortch is really a threat to steal snaps from Michael Wilson, which brings me to the other point is you look at the 3 receivers that are currently ahead of Michael Wilson on the depth chart. The biggest, or let me say that the tallest starting receiver for the Arizona Cardinals right now is Hollywood Brown at 5'8".
Oh my god,
Yeah,
that is a fact that is
the heaviest starting receiver for the Arizona Cardinals right now is Rondale Moore at 181. This team desperately needs size, right? Marquise Brown, Rondale Moore, and Greg Dortch don't provide that. So he's going to be able to play on the outside. I've got a feeling that one of those receivers between Brown, Moore, and Dortch is going to get phased out of the lineup. So I don't know what type of production you're going to see this year from Michael Wilson, but man, there's just a huge hole on this roster for somebody who can play on the outside. They can give them a little bit of size and could potentially be a red zone option for them.
Yeah, the size is definitely a huge consideration, just given the depth chart that they have in place at this point, like you mentioned. Now we don't have updated ADP for the month of June just yet. That should be coming over on dynastyleaguefootball.com. But last month, and again, this is prior to the release of DeAndre Hopkins, so take that with a grain of salt. But wide receiver 78.
Yeah,
There's
ridiculous.
not there's no risk in buying into Michael Wilson at this point.
Well, really
You know
quickly,
what
Kate,
you're yeah.
Rondale Moore going as wide receiver 62. There's just no way that I'm taking Rondale Moore after we've seen him for multiple years in the NFL over Michael Wilson, right?
Oh, not even he's been a flash in the pan, and I get it. Like, he's an exciting player, but again, like, when we're considering viable fantasy options, who has a chance to be,
Like somebody
maybe
that's useful, right?
somebody that's useful. Like Rondale Moore, we've seen his role, and he is the gadget player. He is the guy that, yeah, you're gonna maybe get the ball in his hands and see what he can do after the catch. But in terms of like air yards that you're actually going to be targeted down the field to offer you some upside, that's non-existent.
No.
Give me Michael Wilson, especially at that price. But again, you're going to have to go into this with zero expectations for 2023. That, like, it's a lost season. Move on. Um, but I do think this is, perhaps a time to buy and just stash, because
Yep.
I don't want to take the risk that, like, if this season starts going south, we realize Caleb Williams is in the cards, and then suddenly the ADP for these receivers start to go up because we
Yep.
know the upside of Caleb Williams or
All right,
Drake May.
Yeah, let's talk about a receiver that I'm trying to sell right now when we get back. This episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make a fast break to FanDuel during the NBA playoffs because right now, new customers can get a no sweat first bet up to $2,500. That is $2,500 back in bonus bets if your first bet doesn't win. I still think right now is the best time to bet on the Nuggets to win the NBA championship. I saw the odds this morning of them to win the series, and it's still juicy. I don't care that it's 1-1. I still love the Nuggets. There's no better place to bet on all the playoff action than America's #1 sportsbook. Visit FanDuel.com/locked on and get a no sweat first bet up to $2,500. That is FanDuel.com/locked on. FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA. We want to thank you for making Locked On Dynasty your first listen of the day. Every dayers, Matt and Ryan will be back on Tuesday and Wednesday to continue our NFC West preview. They're going to tell you about some of their favorite buys and sells, so make sure you tune in for that. Kate, I want to talk about some sells for the Cardinals because the one that just jumps off the sheet for me is Hollywood Brown, who is being drafted as wide receiver 32 right now in Dynasty League football. I won't even be surprised if that goes up once we get some new ADP, but only one career 1,000-yard season. He struggled to stay healthy. Now he's in a situation with likely poor quarterback play this year. I wonder if he's a candidate to get traded like midway through the season to a team that maybe wants to add a little bit more speed because I don't know how he fits in long term with the Cardinals. If I could flip him for, oh man, there's so many receivers. George Pickens, who's going 2 spots behind him, I would do that all day.
Yeah, I definitely I think we're gonna see sort of maybe a temporary bump, just given the absence of DeAndre Hopkins. Because I mean, you're looking at this receiver core. We just mentioned it. Like you're gonna assume that Marquise Brown could be, headed for 10 targets a game, and 9 times out of 10, if you hear a receiver is gonna get 10 targets a game, you're gonna be all in on that guy, right? But like this is a moment where I think you have to look at like the efficiency metrics and think, obviously we know there's a lot of upside here, but we saw a pretty big drop off in production without Kyler Murray here
That's
in
the
this
thing.
offense. That's the biggest concern here. And like interestingly enough, obviously like without Kyler Murray, lost every single game. Like there was no upside for this team, but Marquise Hollywood Brown, for as much speed as he brings, he doesn't have the build of a true wide receiver
No.
one. He just doesn't.
And we're going into his age 26 season, and it hasn't really happened. And he's played with good quarterbacks, playing with Kyler Murray and Lamar Jackson. Like he's had opportunities. It just hasn't really turned into anything that you can consistently rely on from week to week. So my strategy is and has been, I'm going to go to other owners in my league or managers in my league and say, hey, this guy's going to get 10 plus targets a game without DeAndre Hopkins. Here, just take him. Give me somebody who's going to get, fewer targets like George Pickens, because that's a trade that I'm trying to make all day long. And man, there's so many receivers that are even being drafted behind him that I like more. Like you can get Jahan Dotson at wide receiver 35, Christian Kirk at wide receiver 37. I even like Rashad Bateman at wide receiver 39, all more than Hollywood Brown. I could see his value really cratering by October, November.
This is one of those things that, again, I think it might depend on sort of your situation. If you need, I hate to call Marquise Brown a year one loner because I do think he's very talented on the field, brings a ton to the receiver position. That's not necessarily size, but last year in games with Kyler Murray averaged almost 16 PPR points per game. Now, some of those games did have DeAndre Hopkins missing for a period of time. So that's where this projection becomes a lot trickier. But without Kyler Murray, Marcus averaged 36 receiving yards per game, 7 PPR points. Like it just
almost
goes to show
unrosterable.
you.
Like in your redraft leagues, like you could literally drop him and you wouldn't have been losing anything.
Yeah, like that. you see just how low the floor is for Marquise Brown without Kyler Murray there. Now, again, like you're going to see some bump in targets, but you have to worry about that efficiency. Now,
Is there
I
any
think,
part of you that's going to hold on to him in the case that they happen to draft Caleb Williams at number 1 next year, and it's like, oh, hey, we've got the best quarterback prospect in years to come out, and he's going to be throwing the ball to Hollywood down the field?
yeah, I'm making the case that I'm holding all of these players, Marcus. Like I took a look at the ADP for every single player who I think could reasonably touch the ball in Arizona right now. Kyler Murray, QB 12. Okay. Sure. James Conner, who's probably like it, if in terms
We'll
of
get to
touches
him.
per game, yeah, we'll get to him. But RB 38, Keontae Ingram, who I'm sure will probably touch the ball, RB 80, Marquise Brown, wide receiver 32, Rondale Moore 62,
Mhm.
Michael Wilson 78, Greg Dortch 107, Trey
Steal.
McBride tight end 19. Like there is no value in really selling any of these players, I'd argue, because you're not getting much return. When we're balancing out the potential for maybe volume, even if that's low efficiency volume, versus potential future opportunity, whether that be with Caleb Williams, Drake May, or a healthy Kyler Murray. Like, what is the upside in selling any of these players? Because I don't really see it.
Well, I just think for Hollywood, there's a chance that his value just completely craters and tanks over the next 12 months, right? Because I know how dynasty managers think because I happen to be one, right? Like once he gets over that age of 26 and it's another year without 1,000 yards, your value just, it falls off the face of the earth, right? So I want to trade him now before the year starts and just try to get some kind of similar value, um, because I just don't see him ever hitting to the point where I feel comfortable starting him week to week in my dynasty league. But uh, Kate, I did want to ask you about one other player as a sell before we move on. You mentioned Trey McBride, who I believe is tight at 19 the last time I checked. He's only 23 years old. Now, he is going to be splitting snaps with the corpse of Zach Ertz this year, but
Oh,
I know. Would you sell him at 19 or are you just going to hold on to him?
I'm gonna hold on to him. See, like coming out of college, right? We had him firmly in line for tight end 1 of the 2022 NFL draft class, firmly in position. Now, when you looked at the efficiency of him all season long, like it performed just across the board as one of the poorest tight ends in this entire draft class in
Mhm.
2022. One of the worst receiving grades out of all of the tight ends in this class. Like, just wasn't overly productive,
No.
and wasn't efficient in the opportunities he got. Um, for the gap in perceived talent as a prospect versus how he performed, I still want to see another season of reconciling those two. Interestingly, his ADP really hasn't dropped since
No.
his rookie season. It was tight end 17 last year, tight end 19 this year. Um, I'm just kind of holding because every single player in the similar range of Trey McBride feels like an equivalent dart throw. So I'll take the youth. I'll take the perspective upside.
Yeah, and I think his kind of best trait coming out of school was his ability to win after the catch. And if it happens to be, Colt McCoy or Clayton Tune, I got a feeling they're just going to want to get the ball out of their hands as quick as possible. And maybe that's where we see more of Trey McBride, having success this year. So I agree. I think at tight end 19, he's a hole. Okay, let's talk about James Conner and what you should do with him in your dynasty leagues next. All right, Kate, let's talk about James Conner, who has been a really solid fantasy player for the last couple of years, even in Arizona. But now we're getting to the point where he's getting up there in age on a team that doesn't have a great offensive line, on an offense that's likely not to score a lot of points this year. What are you doing with James Conner at RB 38?
If I'm in a win now window, Marcus, I'm holding him. If I'm not, I'm also probably holding him. He's just across the board a hold for me. And I think it comes down to so like if you're in a contending window, you're probably not going to find any cheaper production from a running back this season. When he's on the field, he's a locked and loaded starter, just too involved as a receiver. Had 7 games last season with 5 or more targets. I don't think that changes, especially with the loss of DeAndre Hopkins this season. The concern obviously comes with the lack of depth at the running back position, because if they run James Conner into the ground, you're not going to have him for long. But Marcus, at what did I say? RB30. You're not
RB38.
RB38. My apologies.
Yeah.
RB38. It's going to be really, really difficult to find another player that has potential to touch the ball. I'd argue at minimum 200 times this season. With as much.
Let's just be honest. Nobody's trading for James Conner in your leagues, right? Like,
No.
I mean, could you try to flip him for somebody like of comparable value? Maybe, but those trades just aren't going to happen, right? So you're better off just holding him and basically just using his value up this year, knowing that you're going to have to probably go down with a ship on this one. But that's okay, because I do think there is a lot of value like in knowing that somebody's going to get 17 touches every single week.
And what you can do with James Conner, I think this is the beauty. Even if you are in a rebuild mode, I do think you need to hold on to James Conner for the moment. And because I think there's going to be a point this season, as long as he's still healthy, obviously, where there's an injury to, maybe one of the running backs on another contending roster. And suddenly you have James Conner, who is going to touch the ball, 17 times a game. Suddenly James Conner never holds more value than he has in the last 2 seasons. And I think that's the way I'm playing James Conner. But it's going to be hard. You're going to be hard pressed to find another running back in that range with as much potential volume as James Conner could see this season.
Yeah, I mean, and he's going to be the unquestioned goal line back. There's nobody else there that's going to be able to eat into his goal line touches. So it's going to be ugly. Like we're just warning you now. Like if you're watching the game, it's going to be incredibly frustrating watching James Conner. But at the end of the day, I won't be surprised if he has a lot of these games of 19 touches, 62 yards, and a touchdown. And it's RB2 production, a really hard and ugly, unspectacular way.
Yep.
Yeah. All right. So just to recap, we are by Michael Wilson at wide receiver 78 because every other receiver on this roster is 5'8", 171 pounds. He's got some upside there that we like that, and again, this is the front office that invested a top 100 pick in him. Go buy him now. Why he's still cheap. I'm selling Hollywood Brown at wide receiver 32. I think Kate's a little bit more reluctant to do that. So I want to hear your thoughts on that one. And then on James Conner, we're holding because you're just not going to get anything from him in a trade right now. But I think he can still give you some really solid production this season. Who knows about the future there? We want to thank you for making Locked On Dynasty your first listen every day. Again, every dayers. Matt and Ryan will be back on Tuesday and Wednesday to continue our NFC West previews. So be on the lookout for that. You can follow the show on YouTube. We are free and available on all platforms. Follow Kate on Twitter at Kate Magdziuk. I'm at Marcus _Mosher, and we will see you guys next time.